right, let's get started. Welcome everyone to today's conference. I'm Dorothy Baumann-Pauli, the director of the Geneva Center for Business and Human Rights at Geneva University's School for Economics and Management. Our center is the first human rights center for human rights at a business school. In today's event, we'll be discussing a key implementation challenge for human rights, namely, how can companies establish respect for human rights in global supply chains? When governments are unable or unwilling to protect basic human rights, how can these rights become a business reality in the production networks through which companies in a global economy produce their goods? From past experience, we already know that this is a particularly tricky management challenge because it often goes to the heart of companies' business models. But I'd claim that it's not an unresolvable challenge, and I'm happy that we'll be hearing today from several experts about how they have started identifying and remedying human rights issues in global supply chains. The discussion of such a concrete implementation challenge for human rights is timely for many reasons, but let me highlight three. So first of all, of course, today is December 10, and we are commemorating the 72nd anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I'd like us to remember Eleanor Roosevelt, who said, "Where, after all, do human rights begin? In small places close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. Yet they are the world of the individual person, the neighborhood he lives in, the school or college he attends, the factory, farm, or office where he works. Such are the places where every man, woman, and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity without discrimination. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere. Without concerted citizen action to uphold them close to home, we shall look in vain for progress in the larger world." And I think this quote is the best reminder that human rights are not an abstract concept, but need to have meaning in everyday business. A second reason why this is a particularly timely discussion is that next year in 2021, we are celebrating the 10th anniversary of the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights. The UN Working Group has just announced a focus on action, and I'm grateful that we have two members of the UN Working Group with us today. Anita Ramasastry sent us a video message outlining her perspective of the current state of the business human rights field and the working group's plans going forward. We'll share that message with you in a moment. And with us live is Dante Pesca from the working group, who will be able to comment on Anita's statements and elaborate on the, in the panel context, on the UN's plans for the upcoming decade of action. And so, finally, and last but not least, we certainly also need to acknowledge that 2020 is a special year. It has been a particularly challenging year. We're still in the middle of a pandemic and many companies are struggling. But in this context, we have also seen again that workers in global supply chains are particularly vulnerable to systemic shocks. And at the same time, it's clearer than ever before that global supply chains are only as strong as their weakest links. And I find it encouraging that many companies are committed to use this crisis as an opportunity to innovate, to build back better, and to make their supply chains more resilient by integrating human rights. So in this spirit, it's my great pleasure to partner for this event with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development and the International Chamber of Commerce and our joint colleague, Sarah Dekisch. I'll now briefly hand over to Davide Fiedler from the World Business Council for Sustainable Development and Crispin Conroy from the International Chamber of Commerce for some words of introduction. And then we'll hear from Anita and Dante and the panel experts. Sarah will be facilitating the panel discussion. And just for your planning, this is a 90 minutes event and there will also be a recording. Throughout the event, please use the chat box to interact with us, with the panelists, and also with each other. We received more than 300 registrations for this event from people with very heterogeneous and interesting backgrounds. And I'll encourage you to use the chat box to also reach out to each other. We'll leave time for questions in the end, and some of the questions that you put in the chat we can raise with the panelists. And so with this, over to you, Davide.
Thank you, Dorothee. And thank you to all the panelists and to the speakers today. Thank you to Crispin and Dorothee for co-organizing this with us, with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. For those who don't know the World Business Council, we are an organization bringing together about 200 leading companies on topics of sustainability. We bring together the organizations, the companies to discuss and find solutions to the biggest sustainability challenges that the world is facing. And one of the topics that's been gaining more and more traction over the past few years is business and human rights. I work in that project, and we bring together on operational level our members to learn from one another, as well as we try to engage the C-suite of these companies to try and really make sure that this agenda is recognized and has the attention of the boards and of the C-suites, and especially of the CEOs, who we believe have a special role to play in this space. I'm really happy. I think this is the second event, and definitely not the last, that we're doing together with the Geneva Center for Business and Human Rights and with the ICC. So I'm looking forward to the discussion today. Look forward to very insightful discussion and really experiences of all the participants today. So with that, I would like to hand over to Crispin. Thank you all for joining.
Great, thank you very much, Davide. That's great, and thank you, Dorothee, as well for your introduction. It's a great pleasure for ICC to co-host this second event together with the Geneva Business and Human Rights Center and with you, Davide, the World Business Council on Sustainable Development. It's especially pleasing to be able to hold the event today, as you mentioned, Dorothee, on the 10th anniversary of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. And also, as you mentioned, it's great in the context of the upcoming 10th anniversary of the UNGPs, of the Guiding Principles. And we're particularly pleased to have both Anita as chair and Dante as vice chair to join us and participate. ICC is very pleased to be working with Anita and Dante and the working group in the context of their UNGP 10-year plus initiative, which is a multi-stakeholder initiative working on a stock take of the last 10 years and the vision for the future, a roadmap for the future. And we're actively engaging with them on in that process. As the institutional representative of over 45 million companies of all sizes in over 100 countries, it is important for ICC to promote within that network members to discuss how they can, in their daily operations, implement human rights due diligence, but also to explore together existing tools and to discuss the gaps and many challenges. So that's why we're particularly happy to participate in this event today as co-hosts. And we look forward also to carrying out these sorts of activities in other regions of the world throughout our network. And of course, as you said, David, to the next event that we co-host together here in Geneva. Thank you to all of you joining today. It's great to see that number of registrations. Thank you to the participants, to the co-hosts, and also to you, Sarah, for your moderating of the event. I'm looking forward to it very much. Thank you.
Thank you both, David and Crispin. Now let's hear directly from Anita, directly meaning via a video message, and I'll ask Dante to comment and elaborate on Anita's statements later.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends, greetings from Seattle, Washington. I'm sorry I can't be with you live today given the time difference. I want to begin by thanking the Geneva Center for Business and Human Rights, the International Chamber of Commerce, and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development for this kind invitation to briefly address you today. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to share reflections on ways we can ensure respect for human rights in global supply chains. As we celebrate Human Rights Day today, we need to pause and reflect and think of the millions of workers toiling in global value and supply chains, bringing us the products we use and consume regularly. As we think of them, we need to redouble our collective efforts to build a sustainable future for all. It is at the core of the mandate of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights that I chair as we have been given the task to promote global implementation of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, or as we call them, the UNGPs. We see the Guiding Principles as a bedrock document to help achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Making human rights due diligence part of standard business practice is a key issue for our ongoing project focused on the next 10 years of business and human rights. With the 10th anniversary of the Guiding Principles just around the corner, coming up in June next year, we have undertaken a project known as the Next Decade of BHR. We will take stock of the first 10 years of the Guiding Principles and design a roadmap for global implementation in the next decade. Under the UN Guiding Principles, all business enterprises have a responsibility to respect human rights. And the process of continuously conducting so-called human rights due diligence is a core requirement for businesses in fulfilling that important responsibility. Human rights due diligence was introduced as this core concept in the UN Guiding Principles. Since its debut, it's seen a wide uptake in standards for responsible business conduct since then. Notably, ILO and OECD frameworks are closely aligned with the Guiding Principles, particularly around human rights due diligence as an entry point for preventative management of negative impacts. It is now also at the center of regulatory developments, of course, with increasing backing from business and investors. Human rights due diligence provides the tool for companies to identify and address salient human rights risks in their own activities and value chains, whether we are talking about endemic impacts such as forced and child labor or harassment of human rights defenders. We've also seen that it has been vital to address human rights impacts that have surfaced during 2020. Workers risking their lives without adequate protections against the COVID-19 coronavirus, or racial discrimination that is deeply rooted in our societies and the economy. Companies that have had human rights due diligence in place have been able to act proactively and creatively to address these challenges and issues. The working group therefore considers that human rights due diligence is a key tool in the global efforts to build forward better in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. It enables companies to focus their attention on the most severe human rights risks and to identify actual or potential impacts to people as part of any response to the pandemic. We see human rights due diligence as well as key to so-called future-proofing business activities so that companies can address impacts to people and planet rapidly and proactively as they emerge. We heard this at the UN Forum last month, the UN Forum on Business and Human Rights, where companies and investors reaffirmed that having strong human rights due diligence systems, supplier relationships, and supply chain visibility in place prior to the pandemic have been crucial for companies to navigate the challenges of COVID-19. So we've really looked at the haves, the companies that have taken this on board versus the have-nots, and what that means to sort of sustainable, resilient models. While this reflects the lessons learned of leading companies that have been taking steps to translate commitments into action, the reality is that too few companies are moving towards effective human rights due diligence. We have a strong evidence base that voluntary measures aren't getting us where we need to be. The recent corporate human rights results affirm other data we have seen over the last few years. They highlighted that out of 230 companies assessed, 79 scored 0 for human rights due diligence. Another tracker, Just Capital, has looked to see which companies have invested in COVID-19 protections for workers. Interestingly, the Just 100, as they're called, companies that have invested, seem to be actually outperforming other companies who have not taken such steps in the market. But with this bleak backdrop of most companies not investing in due diligence, the consensus among participants across all sectors and all geographies at the UN Forum was both that laws are needed at this point and that laws are coming. Our future is one now of mandatory measures. Of course, the UN Guiding Principles set out the legal and policy implications for how to operationalize the state duty to protect through a so-called smart mix of measures that include legally binding measures, particularly where voluntary measures continue to leave significant gaps in human rights protections. The working group is therefore encouraged by the current momentum toward mandatory human rights due diligence regimes across a growing number of jurisdictions, particularly in the EU. With respect to the Swiss context, even if the Swiss Responsible Business Initiative was rejected by the cantons, the message from the majority of people was loud and clear. Mandatory due diligence is needed. The concept is a prime example of the impact of the UN Guiding Principles since 2011. The working group has noticed a rapid sea change in 2020, with governments and companies alike committing to mandatory human rights due diligence in multiple fora. Indeed, building out regulatory responses is a key issue for the working group's ongoing efforts to develop the roadmap to advance implementation of the guiding principles in our next decade project. The working group has issued recommendations to the EU in the context of the legislative proposal. Allow me to mention a few key points that may be relevant for your discussion today. In our letter to the Commission, we highlighted that it is critical for mandatory measures to, first, cover all internationally recognized human rights and all types of adverse human rights impacts. Second, apply across value chains, not just within supply chains, and apply to both groups, extraterritorial operations, and business relationships. Third, go beyond reporting regimes and require meaningful processes and outcomes. Fourth, require businesses to take measures that facilitate access to effective justice and remedy. We know that this is going to be a difficult issue to tackle, but the issue of accountability and remedy is key to an effective due diligence mechanism. We also want mandatory human rights due diligence to set out clear compliance, monitoring, and enforcement structures and procedures that do facilitate access to effective justice and remedy. This reflects the fact that remedy is one of the most important tools for prevention. As part of the UNGP's 10-year project, we've also given focused attention to another key driver for scaling up due diligence: the role and leverage of financial sector actors, including institutional investors. Of course, investors themselves have a responsibility to respect human rights and to undertake human rights due diligence under the guiding principles, like any other business. In conclusion, let me also stress that even if government-led legal and policy change in many regions lags behind, that does not mean companies cannot or should not move. On the contrary, their responsibility to respect human rights applies regardless of government performance. And effective due diligence is a key part of meeting that responsibility. We saw that in home state jurisdictions that traditionally considered themselves strong protectors of human rights, that often the law was absent during the COVID-19 pandemic to protect workers. It was human rights due diligence and company action that filled the gap. Emerging practices demonstrate it can be done. It is also encouraging that business organizations are taking up the challenge. We hope that more will follow the example set by the World Business Council of making human rights due diligence a membership criteria. We look forward to continued dialogues with stakeholders to envision a coherent and effective way forward for making human rights due diligence part of standard business practice. Thank you again, and I'm really delighted that my colleague and Vice Chair, Dante Pesce, will be with you for the discussions today, and he can share more about our 10-year project, which he is leading on behalf of the working group. Thank you again.
Excellent. So Dante, Anita has already handed over to you from afar, but please share a quick reaction to Anita's message with us, and what would you add or highlight for the forward-looking business human rights agenda?
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation, and I will just complement what my colleague Anita had just said. We're practicing what the General Secretary of the UN, Mr. Guterres, calls inclusive multilateralism. We report to the Human Rights Council, which is only made out of governments, so an intergovernmental body. But we have decided from the very beginning of the implementation of the guiding principles, our colleagues that set up this criteria, to have a very inclusive process, to have participation of all stakeholders, and to broaden the tent of ownership of the business and human rights agenda. So this process is based on participation, and the stock-taking exercise is not just a desktop exercise. It's by listening to the practitioners as much as we can, north, south, east, west, to understand the practical experience, the accomplishments, but also challenges and obstacles, and try to understand what it'll take to overcome those obstacles. So this is the spirit. And when we look into the future has to be a global implementation in which the working group or agencies are just a supporting function. And what we're trying to do is leading from behind. In the sense that we can provide coordination of efforts, provide strategic guidance and orientation, that we will not deliver the job. The job has to be delivered on the ground by policymakers and let's say public servants, by business leaders, by academics, by union leaders, by civil society overall, indigenous, etc. When we look at the evaluation, we're following a three levels evaluation on structural conditions. So we have seen in the last 10 years a big change in the narrative. Business and human rights is not alien for big business industry associations conversation. That's a gain. We're looking at processes, let's say the treaty process, the EU legislation on human rights due diligence, mandatory due diligence, and many other processes at industry level, etc., going through, and that's very good. But then when we look at outcomes on the ground and real change in life experience for real people, we have very little data, very little evidence. And overall this year with the pandemic, of course, the figures are going backwards. So even if we might be making some progress here and there, the overall picture is not very good. So when we look into the future, we know already certain things. The ecosystem for respect for human rights by business is not there yet, except in certain jurisdictions. We need to make it normal everywhere. And the relation between Pillar 1 and 2 is not sufficiently strong. And even, and of course, Pillar 1, the state duty and the state leadership is not there yet. The appetite or the political will is there in some places, but in many other governments is not there yet. And also the problem of policy coherence, vertical policy coherence, but not horizontal. So the cross-cutting issue, business and human rights overall, is not really cross-cutting when we see government functions operating, but the same thing can apply for business, isolated in a silo, but not as a cross-cutting element that drives decisions, etc. And then when we see positively our pockets of excellence of companies, coalitions, associations, but we don't see yet mainstreaming, and that is basically the goal that we need to move from pioneers to mainstream. And I will say overall, we have a positive, let's say, result so far on the high end, and processes have kicked off. That then we have a long way to go on implementation on the ground and monitoring and making sure of its effectiveness. But so far, at least, we're building a coalition of the willing, and the mainstream industry associations like ICC are part of this coalition, which is very important because that gives us a perspective, a realistic perspective, that the goals that we need to achieve are, let's say, are reachable, at least in theory, and the political will and the support from key players like the World Business Council as well is there already, which is a precondition, let's say, if we really want to be ambitious looking into the future. So thanks again, Dorothy.
Thank you, Dante, for these excellent complimentary comments on Anita's message. We'll have more time during the panel discussion to pick up aspects of those dense messages. But let me now hand over to Sarah Dakish, our joint colleague. Sarah is a business human rights expert and has been supporting our collaboration between the Geneva Center for Business Human Rights, ICC, and World Business Council for Sustainable Development for several months. Sarah previously worked directly with companies in the context of Amfori BSCI, and she's has been a human rights consultant in Switzerland. Sarah will introduce the panelists and guide us through the conversation. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Dorothée. So indeed, thank you also, Dante, for this transition, because I guess it's an excellent transition into our panel. So indeed, challenges about monitoring on the ground, key management challenges, as Dorothée mentioned earlier, but not impossible challenges. So let's see where we stand today and what our panelists have to share about that. So before we go into the discussion, let me briefly introduce you, these panelists, to you. I'll start with the ladies first, of course. Risha Mittal on the one hand. So if we were around a normal table, I would look at you now, but I virtually, through my screen, look at you. So Risha is a Senior Director of Supply Chain Innovation and Partnerships at the Fair Labor Association, a multi-stakeholder initiative which mission is to improve workers' lives. For the past 18 years, Misha has been working with businesses, civil society organizations, and governments on different issues in both manufacturing and agricultural supply chains. We also have Vera. I'm looking to you now, Vera. Vera is Senior Director, Social Impact and Sustainability at Aldo Group. Aldo Group, for those who don't know the company, it's a Canadian retailer operating worldwide on shoes and accessory stores. Vera started to work as a social auditor and has spent the past 15 years helping global retailers and brands also improving workers' lives and conditions. We also have the pleasure to have André Podlajsek with us. André is working at Schindler Group, so after having been charged with developing and implementing a responsible supply chain program in the global procurement function first, André is now head of corporate sustainability at Schindler Group. And Schindler is a Swiss company, one of the world's leading providers of elevators, escalators, and moving walks. You have certainly already seen the logo when you take the elevator indeed. And we also have Peter Nestor with us. Peter is head of human rights at Novartis, which he joined not too long ago after spending 8 years in the human rights practice at BSR. I guess I don't have to introduce Novartis to you. You're all familiar with the Swiss pharmaceutical company, and Peter is also co-chair of the Human Rights and Labor Subcommittee of the Pharmaceutical Supply Chain Initiative. And Dante will stay with us also throughout the panel. So identifying and evaluating where companies' risks on human rights are when operating in such vast companies with very large supply chains actually is the challenge. So where do you start? How do you do that? That would be my first question. I will maybe start with you, Peter. So at Novartis, you have started to map out your suppliers, I guess starting with those most at risks. Can you maybe explain us in a couple of words how you have started this, how you are proceeding, and where you stand today?
Sure. Thanks very much, Sarah, and very happy to be here. What a great way to celebrate Human Rights Day. Thanks for convening this this panel. So yeah, just very briefly about Novartis. We are a pharmaceutical company, as you mentioned. We're headquartered in Basel, Switzerland. We have about 100,000 people, employees around the world, and we have operations in almost every country in some capacity or another. So our risk identification process is a big challenge, both within our own operations, but then also in our supply chain. As I'm sure you can imagine, the supply chain for a major pharmaceutical company is highly complicated, it's heavily regulated, and there are risks that are buried everywhere. Let me talk about one program that we've found some really good value in, and then an area of limitation. In terms of the more sort of structural risk assessment program that we've been running for a few years now is our market assessment program. So this is going into the field and into markets where we have operations or significant suppliers, and getting in the field and understanding what the risk looks like on the ground. They are time intensive. They do take budget. We can only do about 4 per year. We've completed 8 assessments since 2017. We had to do remote assessments this year, of course. But we found that it really is valuable. I think, you know, it's important, as I said, to be on the front lines and meeting people within your own organization who are working with suppliers and third parties and on the ground. Often at headquarters, we may have a policy that ticks all of the boxes from a human rights standpoint, but we really need to see how that policy is actually implemented in some of our higher risk markets and talk to the people and build relationships with the people on who are implementing those challenges. Like, what we found is that it's not necessarily a risk identification process. Often we know what the risk is if we're going into a particular market. It's more of a solution generation process where we can then meet the person on the ground and talk to them about what might be required from a human rights standpoint or some ideas that we might have, and then understand what the world looks like from their perspective in the field and where this actually needs to be implemented. So it's been both risk identification, but also solution development. It also gives us some great examples to bring back home to Switzerland, where often at headquarters, you know, people kind of still look at me strangely. What are you doing in human rights? We don't have any human rights problems in Novartis. Well, you know, it's always nice to have good examples that you pick up from these market assessments that really bring it home and say this company is not just based here. The challenge and the limit that we have really run into, I think, is twofold. One is that a lot of our most serious human rights risks lie deeper in the supply chain. That's not going to be new to anyone, right? This is 3 or 4 tiers down, and it can be very difficult to access those suppliers, to understand what's going on. But again, in many cases, we already know what some of the risks are, or there have already been reports from civil society that have identified some of these risks, and it's incumbent upon us to try to figure out what we want to do to address them. The biggest challenge for us is to try to figure out how to prevent those risks from happening going forward, and how our own due diligence can do that. Companies are really good at, say, reading a report about a case of forced labor that perhaps names a supplier. We can then go back into our system and look up and see whether we're doing business with that supplier, or ask our own suppliers if they're doing business in that market or with those particular suppliers. What we don't do as good of a job of yet, I think, is working in the field to actually identify red flags and figure out where the next forced labor case is going to come from, not the one that we already know about or that has already hit the news or the headlines. So there are, of course, red flags that you can pick up, but that still, for us, when we get really deep in the supply chain, that for us is a big challenge, and hoping we can have some more conversation about that as we get into the panel.
Absolutely, thank you very much. So on your last point, I will come back to that later. Maybe if you could just share in one word, you mentioned market assessment program and how you go directly on the ground. How do you identify which market you choose, actually?
Yeah, so there are some existing tools out there that look at country risk from a human rights standpoint. We developed a bespoke tool in-house and combined a lot of the indexes that are out there. So we take a look at the country's human rights profile on a number of different indexes, some of which are more related to government issues, some of which are directly related to business issues. I hope that we will be able to make that tool publicly available in 2021. That's one of our goals for the new year.
Okay, interesting. Thank you. And maybe we'll come back to that later as well. Okay, thank you. Then I'd like to move to Andre. So because Andre, when we met, I think now 1 or 2 years ago, you impressed me also when you explained about everything you are developing and implementing at Schindler. I think at the time you were still in the procurement function. So you were thinking, okay, we have to do something here. We have to find a way to get a bigger transparency and visibility over our supply chain. And you were just starting with that. So can you maybe share in a couple of words how you have started this, what methodology or logic you have been following, and what you have achieved so far, and sort of what threshold have you achieved by today? We don't hear you. No, we hear sort of a strange noise. No. No, it's not working. Do you want maybe to see, to check this on your side, and then maybe I'm...
Yeah, is it better now?
Now it's working, yeah, okay. Excellent.
Okay. I was able to switch my system as I said earlier.
Yeah, you heard us, yeah.
So yeah, I'm happy that we can now discuss where we are now, that we met when we started the program, and now we can review what has happened so far. So as already Peter Nestor was saying, the challenge is really the size of the company. Similar to Novartis, also Schindler is active in about 100 countries. And we do have operations in these 100 countries, and we also have manufacturing in many countries, and we do have local supply chains because we typically work with local businesses together when installing an elevator, for example, in a construction site. So that is typically a cooperation. And what we also found is that transparency is really the issue that we were facing first. It wasn't possible from a corporate point of view to look at our supply chain and do this first step of risk assessment or identifying the most salient risk, because we didn't even have that, let's say, group level overview in the necessary level of detail. We of course know where we are active and we know where we are spending money, but going into that level of detail, where are our suppliers? What are they doing? What is our connection to them? That was our first step. So establishing a system that allows us to look at the supply chain And similar to what Dante said in the point of coherence and the silos, breaking down these silos also in the company. Because of course we have different business units that do different parts of the job, and they all have their own information storage and their own way of working with that information. And our first step was really to bring all these information sources together and have one platform that allows us to identify and then also manage the risks. And the interesting part here was to see that there was also a business need for that. So it wasn't purely that we would say, because of human rights, we had to make this investment. And now it was actually a business benefit that we said, transparency is helping us in all these cases. It was actually driven also by quality, that we're saying we need better information here, we need a better oversight, not in the sense of control, but in the sense of identification and in the sense of also rewarding good results. And that maybe is my second message here, to say it's not just about identifying risks, it's also about rewarding areas where it's working good, where there's good results, so that you also have this positive effect of saying this is actually going very well, we should keep on doing it that way. Also praising a supplier for doing it in a very good sense, and not just looking out for things that are not working well. So it's a balance of these two, I would say. And now, as you said, where are we now and what's now where we want to go? We are doing an approach that we say we start from the top, from the corporate procurement, and then we go to the regions, and then we go to the local entities. That also has to do with the idea of learning. So we need to have experts in the company that know how to look at those issues. We need to have experts in the company that help identifying these red flags. And for that, we thought it's useful if we start somewhere with a smaller group. We started with a smaller group of procurement experts, and now we go into the company. And I assume that this is a good approach. I hope so. What I already learned from Peter Nestor in this very short introduction from him was to take also more the issues from the local sites and learn with them. So maybe that is one thing that's actually needed more, that you look more at what is happening very locally. Similar to where do human rights happen? They happen in the workplace of a single person. In the same way, we should also look at the workplace of our suppliers or of our technicians even. What is going on there and how can we support that?
Thank you, indeed. And I will come back to that point as well, because that's linked to a question that came also from the audience. But before we come back to these points, and thank you again, Andrea, I'll move to Vera. So Vera from Aldo. Here we have more of a textile and shoe company. So you are also selling a variety of products. How are you doing that at Aldo Group?
Yes, hello everybody. So I think we, in the complexity of our supply chain, which is very complex, but I think way reduced than Peter and Andre, we have a bit more visibility because of our sourcing strategy, which is essential for our product. However, it's still, it is a task to keep the transparency ongoing because we are a fashion industry that is moving very, very fast. So this is our one of our biggest challenges. So let me start off what we used to do or how we started the program. We started, like most of the brands, I guess, by establishing our code of conduct, related policies, our manuals, like the theoretical part. And then the real journey started, no? Where we had to implement and transfer and transmit all these policies internally as well as externally. So after doing that with a monitoring process that we established based on our procedures, we conducted an impact assessment as well as the vendor segmentation program so that we could identify better and set better priorities in our existing monitoring program. So with the time, we then established the social standards that we had created in our policies as a prerequisite to our onboarding requirement for any new supply. And this helped us to keep like a better control of the growth of our supply chain. Of course, this is not a one-time thing. We had to keep on doing it. We are quite a team in place who is also based locally, who is in very close contact with our suppliers, and conducts regular trainings, awareness sessions, to ensure that this monitoring and remedy process is taking place. So for those corrective actions that we have identified during the monitoring process, we also establish a plan on how to implement improvements. And for those improvements that are not taking place, we go and start talking to the supplier and start looking a bit beyond the factory management system to see what is going on, like what is so difficult in implementing the improvements. Is there something that we are doing as a company that is not really making this change happen? Or maybe also the industry, is the industry conducting or behaving in a way that makes it very difficult? So this is a most recent approach that we are taking, in which we are starting really to have a dialogue with our suppliers and understanding where we can change the things, rather than just highlighting the non-conformities and say like, you failed. No, we are trying to start the discussion with them. However, this is an ongoing program, and we started with a lot of pilots and looking if what we're doing is correct and changing it and adjusting it based also on the company size, on the company development, and also on our suppliers' needs and requirements. And we're still in this. So we're still being innovative. We're still trying to figure out which is the best way, and we have a lot to learn and to do. And in the fashion industry, this is a very common practice. I think that most of the brands are doing something similar. So I see that now there is more and more collaboration between brands, more and more talking between the brands, and also multi-stakeholder initiatives, which are starting to share challenges and opportunities and seeing if we can collaborate. And this is really something that I believe on, that we should be doing more and more to, rather than working by ourselves and thinking that whatever we developed is the right thing. No, we need to start looking into it. So yeah, I would say that we are partnering up always with our suppliers more and more. This is really one thing that we are encouraging more, and also partnering up with multi-stakeholders initiatives. So we are part of this will also go deeper into our supply chain. The fact that we are partnering with different multi-stakeholders, because not only staying on the surface.
Yeah, thank you. And you already stole again one of my next questions. So we will come back to that multi-stakeholder approach later on. And indeed, to what extent things can be done individually, and to what extent one has to rely on external support and eventually within a sector or with other actors. But we'll come back to that later. But actually, it's a good transition to Risha. So Risha working in a multi-stakeholder organization and actually establishing the necessary management processes and tools to help companies increasing their traceability, identifying risks, and working out solutions based on these risks is exactly what you do at the FLA. So from your perspectives, what are the key ingredients to properly assess and address risks? And is there, based on that, anything you would like to add to what has been shared so far by our company representatives?
Thanks, Sarah. And it's lovely to hear the fellow panelists, because I think they definitely go at the core of the issue of involving procurement, having issues more in upstream supply chains, and the both collective and individual work that is required. What I do want to focus on is, of course, one is, as companies are working through all of these issues, these are some of the issues as you go upstream become systemic in nature. These are issues which one company or one sector may not be able to control themselves. So we have found a lot of value in engaging with civil society organizations, whether it's the government or with the local trade unions or the NGOs, because what they can help you is set priorities, because companies come with limited resources, and the supply chains are vast as you go upstream. So you have to scope your problem and you have to scope your solution. And that scoping is actually assisted by when you engage with different civil society organizations and the government. The second thing that we see in this whole HRDD frameworks, human rights due diligence framework, is the importance of government engagement. And Dante has emphasized it, that the role of the governments and regulatory framework is so important. Similarly in solutions as well. So if I take an example of what we were trying to do with Nestle, Olam, and Balsu, 3 of our companies affiliates in hazelnut sector in Turkey, looking at child labor issues and looking at how do you improve working conditions at tier 4, which is at the farm level. So in 2012, having no supply chain visibility, to 2020 having 100% segregated supply chain of hazelnut. But it doesn't come easy, and involving the government in the discussion is very, very important, because when you talk about migrant workers, when you talk about seasonal migrant workers, the registration of labor contractors is done by the government. The camps for the workers is done by the government. Again, as I said, as you go upstream, the problems become so huge and systemic in nature that a company cannot have the resources to do it. So having that government engagement is very important. The last point that I do want to make here is, what we have also realized is we have to move beyond this piloting phase. Because I think there's so many pilots that are existing, and pilot is successful, but when you come to a scaling strategy, everything falls apart. So another thing that we are trying, at least in Turkey, is looking at the work we did in one sector, but what we saw is these workers are migrant in nature, so they're working in cumin sector, they're working in cotton, they're working in sea bass, sultanas. So what you can do is you can actually cooperate beyond your own sector if you figure out what are those meeting points. So in a way that, if we started working with one company only in hazelnuts, but now we can work with 8 companies, multinationals, and 30 suppliers with the government. So in a way, to look at what are those leverage points which would bring scalability to those solutions is very important. So I would say that I don't even want to talk about monitoring, because I think we are past that discussion now. I think companies should know how to monitor. I think the focus should also then be on how do you realize sustainable and scalable solutions. So that's where at least the FLA sits at the moment with our affiliates.
Thank you. Actually, I'd like to ask the panelists if you have anything to complement or to add to that before I move forward with the questions. Don't hesitate to interact if there is anything you'd like to share now. Well, if not, then I'd like to come back.
It looks like Andre wants to come in.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to make one comment to what I just learned from Aldo. A very good point from Vera to say, what is it that we are doing that prevents change from happening? I really like this approach, because that was missing in the discussion in the past, in the previous years. It was always like, you need to train your supplier, you need to tell them what they do wrong. And a very good point of saying, actually, we are part of that problem. We need to look at our processes and see, how is my process in my company preventing change because of the way how I do business. If I'm sending out orders like 1 million pieces by tomorrow, then it's very likely that there will be overtime happening. If I'm not able to plan my orders in a good way, how should the supplier? So this is a really excellent point. I would like to stress that this is hard for a company to do, but I think very valuable to look at your own processes and think, how is this process impacting human rights because of how it's designed?
Absolutely, and I would agree with you. Indeed, just imposing a code of conduct or expectations is not enough. How do you translate that not only externally, but also in your company itself? How do you bring your procurement to align also with these expectations? So I don't know, Andre, is this a process you have also started at Schindler and also here our other company representatives? How does it work with you? How do you bring your teams internally to align on that? Dante mentioned earlier the importance for policy to align also vertically, but I guess that the same applies in a company as well, across departments, across functions. So how do you approach that?
So since I started the topic, I can maybe enter the first discussion point here. I have to say it's actually more difficult than I thought. So surprisingly, because you have different also fields of thought. So you have the legal view that is very clear on contracts and on codes, and that has to be established. You have a financial view that has a very high position on like payment terms, where it's not just like I could change it because I think it sounds better if it's only 5 days. There's clear rules there that have been established like for decades, and now you are suddenly challenging these rules and asking, can we do it differently? I think that openness to this established in the company to rediscuss these rules that have been around for decades is very, very challenging, I have to say. Or maybe Peter or Vera have already progressed there more.
Go ahead, Vera.
Thank you. One thing that I would like to add is that it's also to look internal is one challenge, but then to align with other customers is a bigger challenge even, no? Because if I adjust my procedures, but the client of the factory, the other client of the factory doesn't, then the factory will keep on having his problems because nothing will change. And this is where the collaboration and what Richa was saying is a key element, where we have to align on certain standards that regardless of what are my procedures, I will not be able, there's no space for movement. And this is the biggest challenge that I see.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks. Just to add to that and to pick up on a point you made earlier, Vera, on the relationships that you're trying to build with customers or suppliers. We're trying to do that as well. And I think also just to pick up a question that came in on the chat of the difference between audits and say a human rights assessment. I think a human rights assessment often provides more scope for these kind of longer term engagements or for addressing more systemic issues than you often find in a typical audit. I would say the audit field has improved a lot over the past, say, 10 or 15 years. But taking a human rights approach really involves, both consultation with a broader group of stakeholders, but also in the scope of what you can take on. And I think it's a really important point. And Andre, I mean, the point you were making about that a lot of processes have existed for a long time before we showed up with the human rights hat and said, hey, there's a problem here. One of the things that we are trying to experiment with is building a sort of longer term remediation plans with suppliers. So for example, if we've got a supplier in a country that where there's a risk of forced labor or migrant labor or exploitation of recruitment fees, maybe they don't have a program that's monitoring recruitment fees. Okay, let's sit down and say, look, we're not going to fire you over this. We don't need you to implement this tomorrow. We understand that it's very difficult, but over the next 3 years, we would like to see you meet certain KPIs that get us to that point where you ultimately have a robust recruitment fee monitoring system. But we'll work with you on that. We're not just going to come in and start sort of slashing and burning for everybody who can't meet an immediate demand. So yeah, I think just, the supplier engagement, but also just the ways that we're thinking about going about doing that.
Mm-hmm. And it's actually about building the capacity of your suppliers and producers to do that. But then concretely, how does it work? And I think, Vera, it's also a discussion we had one day. How do you build the capacity of your suppliers? How do you accompany them? And in the end, it's about also creating a different relationship with them. So, but concretely, how does it work? And what does it imply?
It implies a lot of dialogue, and it implies also a lot of listening to your suppliers and create a relation of trust and long term. No, it is a really hard work, and it's really challenging in the fast fashion industry, I have to highlight. So, so one of the steps, because of the difference between audit and human rights assessment, is that we are moving out of the audits, but keeping on monitoring. And this is really the change that we are looking also to support our suppliers in this dialogue, no? Because we see this audit fatigue as is just getting insane and is not showing any real evidence of improvement there. So this is one way that we have been starting to listen finally to our suppliers when they say, sorry, you are wanting me to have this standard and this standard and this standard, but at the end, I'm not able to even improve in any way because there's so many different standards are aligned. The other one is that we are trying to also talk to other of the customers of the factory, so that of the suppliers, so that we really start aligning our requirements and our standards rather than just establishing our own. And this is very much through multi-stakeholders initiatives, where we are looking to agree on what we are requesting or what we are trying to implement. And I think the long term is basically your values and the way you are establishing your sourcing methodology. And there's that's playing a key role in all the relation with our suppliers.
And here maybe I take the opportunity to ask a question that came from the audience addressed to you, but I guess our other panelists can answer as well. So you mentioned the code of conduct and the way you engage with your suppliers. So do you require them to cascade down the same standards to their supplier further upstream, or how do you do that?
Yeah, and this is one point that with the time and with the learning that we have done, it's always the supplier ownership, we call it, is taking more and more weight in our way of training. So it's like basically we are expecting the supplier to establish a similar process than we have to make sure that their supply chain is fulfilling the requirements. And we are also very supportive in doing this. So we are providing trainings, materials, and also trying to be a bit of an example for them to implement it within their supply chain.
And Sarah, if I may come in on that particular point, I think supplier engagement is definitely key. And, that also relates to one of the other points on, how do you start looking at tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers? I think as you move upstream, the leverage of a company goes down and down and down. And I can take an example, that we did, with rubber supply chain mapping in Vietnam. We had Puma, Adidas, and New Balance, 3 companies. And we were looking at, of course, they engage with their shoe manufacturers in Vietnam. And when we started to look at the rubber supply chain, their components manufactured, then processes, then you go back to the plantations. And what we saw in terms of the supplier engagement, the collective leverage helps. So, if you have shared suppliers, which are shared between these 3 companies, that collective dialogue is very useful. Then once, also when you talk about supply chain mapping, one of the key learnings for us has been you have to not necessarily bring the human rights, child labor, forced labor discussion in the supply chain discussion up front. I think we have to look at it in a way that let me first map my supply chain and establish that trust, and then start to discuss the human rights issue. Because if you mix it up, then I think because suppliers have been, it's have been facing auditing mentality for 20 years, the first thing is, back off. So they would not, we were in Bangladesh, and, these tier 2 suppliers, they said, tier 1 suppliers said, okay, I'm ready to map my supply chain. What if you find child labor? What if you find child labor at a tier 2 supplier or a tier 3 supplier? What exactly would you continue working with me as a company because you have zero tolerance for child labor? Yeah. So I think, as you go upstream, these collective leverage and a different hat is very, very important. But at the same time, a completely, having that long-term view of where you want to reach collectively, so that trust and partnership and the approach itself has to change from auditing hat. So this is at least what have been our experience with, in Vietnam with rubber mapping, or also in Bangladesh on, looking at production, where subcontracting takes place.
Indeed, and we talk more and more about moving beyond audits. And here I would like to turn to Peter and maybe also Andre, but feel free also Vera and the others to add. So how do you go further down in the supply chain concretely? How do you engage your tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, etc.? But also how do you bring on board and consult SMEs? That's also a question that came from the audience along your supply chains.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I can try to speak to a couple of these things and really picking up on the point that Risha made on collaboration. That's the only way right now that I've seen that we as a company at least have been able to make any progress on getting deeper in the supply chain. As you said, the farther upstream you go, the lower leverage you have and the harder it is to try to identify. But what we've been able to do, at least through our industry association, the Pharmaceutical Supply Chain Initiative, PSCI, is identify some common materials and common ingredients that a lot of our peers are also using. I'll give the example of carnauba wax, which was in the news a couple of years ago for some pretty serious forced labor violations in Brazil. We buy carnauba wax, a lot of our peers do as well. So we were able to get together and sort of in terms of engaging lower in the supply chain, we held a webinar and invited our common suppliers to join the webinar and gave them some insight around what the issue is, and around some research we had done about groups working on the ground, and encouraged them to participate in these groups that were building capacity in Brazil and trying to work on addressing these groups on the ground. And now it's on us to continue to follow up with those suppliers. So that's just one flavor of how I think collective action can work deeper in the supply chain. Let me also just pick up this question that came in here on antitrust, because for some of you who may be sitting there thinking, how do you host a webinar with a bunch of your shared suppliers and not run afoul of antitrust? We've done some looking into this, and a lot of these organizations where companies are coming together in the same industry do have pretty clear rules about this. And it's basically avoiding conversations about price or purchase volume, and trying to maintain a safe space where it's anonymous in terms of who is buying from who. I wanted to praise the FLA. We looked at some work that you did, some other groups, the Maritime Anti-Corruption Network, Building Responsibly, other groups where industries are coming together. These antitrust issues are really not as big of a concern as they initially may appear to be. So it is possible to do this collectively and to get deeper in the supply chain.
Thank you very much. Andre, Vera, anything to add?
Yeah, I could add an aspect.
Yeah.
Yeah, one aspect that I would like to add is the question also how to work together with SMEs, and I would like to even make the view a little bit broader. So one thing that I find key now in our work is that we have partnerships and networks established. So like Peter just said with the PSCI, the pharmaceutical industry, we also joined Railsponsible, the railway industry, not necessarily because we thought a train and an elevator is the same thing, no, because we have the same structure of suppliers in the background, the same kind of companies working there. And we found it's already very helpful that you start talking in the same language and address the same issues, because that also helps our suppliers in knowing what to focus on. So what is the issue? If every company has a different language, a different way of addressing it, it is very confusing, and they don't have like Schindler has me and I can sort through all of that and then give a guidance. Those companies typically don't have an expert that could work on only that issue. And the other angle I would like to open is also to say, it's not only about suppliers. Also, we shouldn't forget that very often we work with companies like distributors, or we might even be active in a sector, like we in the construction sector, where our clients are also part of the issue. So an example is that in India, for example, we have joined with other companies in the construction sector to create this initiative called Childhood Under Construction, meaning there's mobile children creches and schools that are built on the construction sites by all these companies active there to prevent children from working there, but going to school. And this was very successful, and was only possible because of getting together and all together accepting there's an issue if families, migrant families, are moving around with the construction sites, so to say, and there's no infrastructure. So it is on us to provide that. And that's what I say, it's not just the suppliers. We are also in a network of distribution or clients that we should address these issues too.
And create the ecosystem that probably Risha also mentioned earlier. Dante, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I would like to weigh in from a number of different angles. One is to remind everyone that the working group issued a report on SMEs and human rights that has been, for the most part, ignored, let's say, but because this is an angle that we know very little about. And the SMEs, what they say is that there is a corporate capture of the state by large companies. So civil society says there's a corporate capture of the state overall. But when we address SMEs, they say public policy are meant to fit the purpose of large companies, not really me. And then the industry associations disproportionately represent the voice of the large members, not the small members. And so that's one, let's say, entry point. And I have to say, my mother is an entrepreneur, and my grandfather from my father's side was a business owner, small business owner. So I'm, let's say, I know what is it to run a company by just witnessing my own family do it. Another element, what we saw in that report was the largest single supply chain in any given country in the world is the state's public procurement supply chain. And the governments have an obligation to lead by example. And also the 25% of the larger companies in the world are state-owned. And in many jurisdictions, state-owned companies and their procurement is also considered to be state procurement. Therefore, there's a role regarding Pillar 1 for governments to set the expectations and to lead by example, and to set the expectations by leading by example, by doing it. So that's one first element, just let's say a reminder. Then the other element is that business to business is a huge driver for improving and for modeling behavior. And SMEs react very fast to the market. So very pragmatic approach in general, not really ideologically driven, and they follow the lead of their clients basically, or their lenders, or both. So that is another element, that it is possible to drive change on massive scale if we get this conversation right. The other thing is that what we need is to align incentives. That's another element that SMEs bring in. They say, I talk with the sustainability people, and they tell me that they want to empower me and to drive positive change, etc. But then I engage with the procurement people, and it's all about cost and lowering cost. And so the incentives are not aligned, and I get message. And I don't live out of a back powder in the shoulder or a diploma. I live out of contracts that are long-term, etc. So that is, let's say, an alignment of incentives inside companies, what SMEs don't see. The other thing is that SMEs on the ground, and I was in a discussion in China quite recently about that, they are concerned also in Sri Lanka, also in my part of the world, Latin America, that fast de-risking. So if we connect human rights with risks, a very fast track for de-risking is don't do business with small companies, and don't do business in weak governance territories or countries, just pull out. And instead of building the infrastructure, the capacity, and strengthening that capacity, you de-risk by just fleeing. And that is easy to do, and it's cheap. And actually your risk profile goes up very fast. So that is an unfortunate, let's say, a side effect, negative side effect of de-risking and not really aligning with what many of you have said, a long-term perspective. And the other thing is that a reminder in terms of risk prioritization. The guiding principles don't go tier by tier, is knowing your impacts, understanding your, knowing and showing, but knowing out of due diligence where the negative impacts happen or might happen, and that can be far away, 14 tiers away as an electronic company using cobalt, or it can be around the corner in your own, almost in your own factory or workplace. But the prioritization is not tier by tier, but risk by risk based on severity. So it can be far, it can be close. And that, of course, is a challenge in terms of how to do that in practice. But surely that is possible to be done. And there are some experiences that are actually dealing with that approach. The other thing on knowing and showing, which is the outcome of due diligence, knowing by whom, and something that the World Business Council for Sustainable Development has issued, known by the CEO and known by the board, something that's being discussed at the World Economic Forum these days. Because is the board that set policies equipped to understand the challenges or not? If it's a diverse board with diverse perspectives and experience and knowledge, might be. And then we'll actually give the instructions or the guidance or the policies to the CEO that should drive the practical implementation of commitments of any kind. And so the knowing and showing by whom. And I will say there is a gap there in knowing by the ones that have power to make decisions. The second element is the meaningful engagement that the guiding principles actually set, so the OECD also on due diligence, by listening to the SME owners and their own workers, not only the top tier or a sample, but actually having mechanism to listen to the real players on the ground. Recognizing that there is power imbalance, as happens with workers without a union, the same thing with an individual company that negotiating with a huge company. Of course, there is power imbalance. There's a role there for industry associations, but also to self-assess yourself, as some of you have said already, because what we need is good procurement practices. And the procurement practices have to be both ways. So improving on the ground at the factory level, the producer level, but also at home in terms of what are the sets of policies that are driving X, Y, Z outcomes. And Better Buying, the foundation in the US, does, I think, a good job in asking the suppliers to judge the client and to put a score on the client, and are the right incentives in place? Is the client, the big company, actually learning, listening, etc.? And so there's huge room for improvement by using leverage. And I will say collective leverage, and actually a report that we issued show that that is the most promising approach. But also there's concern from SMEs, because what they say is when the larger company knows more about me and align better their policies, etc., what happens in practice is that they squeeze me further, and the productivity gains are not shared in a balanced manner. So I never have the opportunity to actually pay better, because every time there's a productivity let's gain, basically I'm squeezed in terms of cost, and that is a concern, because it's not in my interest, some have said, to actually share all my challenges with my client, because they will know how to replace me easily, and they do often, but also they will know where are my productivity potential gains, therefore they will actually squeeze me further. And that is, again, something that requires a conversation among equals, and that conversation among equals is not really happening that much, and there's a lot of room there for improvement. So I will say those are my let's say comments and reflections. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dante, for these points, and indeed very relevant points. I'd like to pick up maybe just some of them and ask our other panelists to react to them before we will try to get maybe one or two questions from the audience and wrap them up. So I took the point of aligning sustainability and procurement in improving that on the ground, but also at home, one point. The other point is whether your boards are on board. Actually, are they aware? Are they able to know and ready to show? And the third point, that is more a point that Risha mentioned earlier, is scaling up. So are there examples of measures that can be scaled up or projects that can be scaled up? So indeed moving away from these pilot projects to really impact that scale. So if we can maybe have a last round on these 3 points, and I'll start with whoever wants to start first. Andre, shoot. I see you smiling.
Okay, smile too soon. So let me comment on the point of aligning procurement practices and human rights or sustainability. That's exactly a very good point. And that was one of the reasons of this portal that we created internally. It doesn't make sense if there's like a procurement view on the suppliers, which is focused on cost. And then there's another view on the suppliers by the sustainability department looking at human rights. So this has to go together. So that was actually what we did. We created one portal where both informations are at the same level and at the same point. So if I open this system and I look at suppliers, I see purchasing value, cost, contracts, and the sustainability credentials of that supplier and the audit results and so on. If procurement is opening the database, they have the same view. So first thing is to have the same point of view and the same availability of data. So they might look at it differently, but we share the same information ground and then can start a discussion. The second thing I would like to point out is we meaning in this case, as it was rightly said, the board has to give the mandate also to procurement to act responsibly. If the only mandate and the only indicator they have is cost, even if they want to, and I have worked in procurement, I know that they are all good people. It's not like the evil that we sometimes see it as sustainability professionals. They are all good people and they wanted to do good for their company, of course, but also working together with suppliers because they actually talk to them like every day. And if they have a sad supplier, it also doesn't make their lives happy. So they were asking me, so what's my mandate to react responsibly? How can I implement that in my decision matrix? How can I reflect correctly on, I had 3 suppliers to choose from. I took that one because it was actually having the best fit of values and approach to what we need. It wasn't the one with the best price, maybe, or maybe it was, but how can I show that to my board that I made a good decision here? And brings me to the point that I'm always taking at this time. It is also about changing the order of decisions. Ideally, we would select our suppliers, also our distributors, our partners, on our values and the fit to what we want to achieve. And then we start working on productivity, cost, effectiveness, efficiency. Not the other way around, that we first select the one who is best on the price, and then we find out this doesn't work because they are neither on the same level of knowledge that we need, nor are they willing to change. So this is also difficult, and we need that mandate from the top, as Dante said. We need to have this understanding on the board level. This needs to be flipped. This needs to change. And I'm very curious to hear from Vera or Peter what their learning was so far in the journey.
Vera.
So I completely agree with you. One experience that I had is that we used to be the social compliance department, no? And we used to be the ones that were saying this vendor is approved or not approved. And I'm slowly moving away from that. It's not my responsibility. I'm not telling the procurement which one approved or not approved. So I'm wanting to reach the level of sharing the same data to create awareness and say this one is a high risk. Until we reach a lower risk, we need to do this, this, and that. It is your decision how much your orders are placed so that we are all on the same level. And I'm not anymore the police person and we're stopping to play that game. It's more like our responsibility of where are we placing the order. So this is something that is a lot with sharing information, with sharing understanding, because as you said, these are not evil people. It's just that their way of working is very differently. And this goes with this responsible procurement practice that I was mentioning at the very early stage, where the department moved to social impact, where we are really working in another section and not the one saying yes or no. This is the responsible of the company from top level.
Thank you, Peter. Think you wanted to add anything?
Yeah, sure. Just 2 quick points. I think one first on the internal buy-in from the board and at the CEO level, and some praise due to Davida and the team at WBCSD for developing the CEO Guide to Human Rights. We were lucky enough to have our CEO sign it this year, and to a cynical outside audience, it might just look like another thing to sign, but it is a nugget of gold internally when I'm trying to get people to listen to me, right? I put a slide up that says our CEO signed on to the CEO Guide of Human Rights, and suddenly everybody is paying attention to what I'm trying to say. So thank you for developing that. It's been incredibly helpful. I actually want to shift over to Risha and get at this point about pilot projects versus scaling, and also bring in a question that came in from the audience on how we scale this up. A lot of what we're talking about is really time and resource intensive relationship building with a really large number of suppliers, and even larger when we get into the deeper parts of the supply chain. Curious to go back to your original comments on trying to move away from pilot projects. Also a personal interest because I have some pilot projects going, so I'm really interested to hear what you say about that. But then some of your experience on how you got to scale up a little bit quicker.
Sure. So I would look scalability from two different angles. One is internal to a company. So as a company, you're a large company as Novartis, how you can scale up internally. I cannot emphasize enough the importance of internal management systems. So top level commitment, resource allocation, public commitment on what you want to do, responsible procurement, supplier engagement, training, monitoring, remediation, and moving that beyond from a pilot stage to say, okay, you know what, we are going to do it across the board. And not looking at it from a time-bound perspective. This is the start date of the pilot and this is the end date. This should be in your DNA as a company. So I think, as quality is in the DNA of a company, so should be human rights due diligence. So I think a lot of companies make that, mistake to say, okay, this is a pilot, I start now and I end then. It shouldn't be seen as a pilot anymore. And that only comes in when you change your management systems from the top to the bottom. So that's one thing. The second thing is when we look at scalability outside of a company, I think this collaboration is very important, but there has to be a very strong backbone function that keeps that collaboration going. And in different sectors, different organizations play that role. Could be industry organizations, could be trade associations. In the case of Morocco strawberry, it was Oxfam, who negotiated that wage, for the strawberry sector. So there was that strong backbone function. In the case of Turkey with agriculture commodities, FLA is playing that role. In cocoa, International Cocoa Initiative is playing that role. So all that to say, I think having that backbone function who keeps all the different stakeholders engaged is very, very important. The third point when it comes to scalability is looking from an area-based approach and looking from an approach of, geographical sense, because what happens is, and we have seen this in cocoa so much, like within the same village, there are 3 companies trying to get information on child labor from their cocoa farmers. I mean, how resource intensive is that? Instead of, saying, okay, I'm going to look at a village, as companies, we are going to collaborate, collect information on child labor across the board, whether it's coffee farm, cocoa farm, or banana, or, palm, and then collectively look at, how we address that issue. Because this is something, at the heart of collaboration, where collaboration doesn't just happen at the, global level or in Europe, but it really happens at the ground level and in true sense of the word. So that's another, and collaboration from an area-based approach is important. The last but not the least is public accountability. I think companies who are visionaries, who are ahead of the pack will go ahead and do it. The issue is, how do you bring the laggards with you? So this is, this is what a voluntary initiative cannot do, like the FLA. This is where the role of public accountability is very, very important. And I'm very glad to see, the human rights due diligence framework at the EU level, because that would bring scale. So I would say these 4 points, both internal as well as, external to the supply chain are very important. And last but not the least, cross-sectoral. Andrea talked about trains and, elevators. I will talk about shoe manufacturers and tire companies, both use rubber. So one uses 93%, another uses 6%. Why not, they can work in a collaborative, so be innovative about it. So these are some points that at least we have understood, from the work that we have done, but you have to get your hand dirty. Like there's no other way to approach this.
Thank you very much, Rishan. I'd like maybe to ask you a question that came up from the audience, and that will be the last question I take because we are running out of time. There was a question about at local level, how well do companies collect and manage issues or concerns that came up? You mentioned that a little bit with child labor, for example, but also are there grievance processes in place? So from your perspective, more an external perspective, does here collaboration also come in, or what are the what are ways here? What would you say?
Absolutely. Again, if you think of an area-based approach, and I can take an example of an informal sector, let's say in Agra, we were working in the leather sector, which is tier 1, then child labor issues where kids were sewing, shoes at their homes. And where first companies were looking more from a supply chain perspective. Okay, what is my supplier doing? But when you took away the supply chain approach and when you said this is an area issue, and let's set up, we have to set up a school. So it was not an Aldo school or a, Bata school or any school. It was a school for the community itself. And that's where, similarly, you can set up grievance mechanisms that are co-owned by, the supplier group there, or again, involving the government is extremely important. And specifically on grievance mechanism, I have to say there's this notion of, oh, workers will get confused if they have too many. No, too many grievance systems give them a choice to call anyone they like, whichever they feel comfortable with. So this notion of, confusing workers is not the right assumption. I think, people should have access. So companies can collaborate. We have many examples, and I know we are running out of time, but happy to get in touch with anyone, who would like to discuss it further.
Excellent.
Can I add one word on grievance mechanism, Sarah?
Yes, and actually I wanted to give you the last word anyway. So then please go ahead on grievance mechanism, and then also maybe if you could share from your perspective, what 1 or 2 or your top 3 takeaways from this session and what you see as it being to be worked out now for the next decade. And then we'll give it back to our
one word on grievance mechanisms. The findings that we have done and the Office of the High Commissioner have done is that most part of grievance mechanisms are not fit for purpose. Do not play a key role in preventing harm. So is more a reactive mechanism than a proactive listening mechanism to give voice for those that might be harmed based on the prioritization of risks. So the point that I'm trying to make is that grievance mechanisms can give voice, can reinforce prevention, and can be early alerts. And that is a missed opportunity for the most part, because they are not really fit for purpose for the most part. So that's the only thing. And of course, there's huge improvement to be made there by making it work properly. The other thing in terms of a reflection, something that we have said before at the working group level is that this is possible. By listening to the different people that have been in this call, practitioners, by listening to the practitioners, we learn a lot. And one key message is that this is an agenda that is not wishful thinking. It's an agenda that is needed, of course, but it's an agenda that is doable. And actually the approach that we follow to facilitate races to the top, competition on on top of the pre-competitive space, but of collaboration in the pre-competitive space, we can only benefit from that approach. So in the pre-competitive space, let's collaborate, learn from each other. In the competitive space, let's race to the top. And in between, we have the regulatory wave coming in that will push up the minimum to a level that the champions are already beyond that minimum. So it's not really something to be scared of. The champions are ahead of that. But a level playing field that is slightly higher only based on standards that already exist. So it's not adding additional requirements, but it's leveling the playing field, making sure that there are no one below the level playing field that is based on international agreements. Is something that the regulatory wave that is coming will put us in that position, at least Western Europe, and we expect a domino effect around the world, replicating the European push or maybe harmonizing, but nevertheless, the market forces will play, and we see that the market is actually playing in favor of business and human rights today. And that is, let's say, a very positive message. So I think in the future, we will scale up and speed up, something that we have been saying many, many times, but based on the practical experience of the doers that are showing that this is possible. Therefore, we need to be smart in how to take into scale what is actually working in reality. And thanks again.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Dante. And we will all be very busy for the next 10 years. So thank you very much again, Dante, Risha, Vera, Andre and Peter. Thank you for having participated, and thank you for these very rich insights. With that, I'd like to hand over again to our organizers. I already stole their wrap-up time, actually, and also sorry that we were not able to address all the questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you for a truly excellent conversation. I'm inspired. Dante started out by saying we need to listen to practitioners. This afternoon, I think we were privileged to hear from practitioners that work based on the premise that outsourcing production doesn't have to mean to outsource responsibility. And I really want to thank Vera, Peter, Andre, Richa, and Dante for so honestly sharing the challenges of slicing and dicing very long supply chains, building capacity and a trusted relationship with suppliers, aligning internal operations, incentive systems, governance mechanisms, and many more aspects we've touched upon. I'm really looking forward to sharing the recording of this conversation with my students. It's been truly inspiring, and I hope the audience feels the same way. Before we close, I'd like to make an announcement. The Geneva Center for Business and Human Rights is launching next year a Business and Human Rights Clinic. And the purpose for this clinic is to deal exactly with such applied implementation challenges of business and human rights. My team will be working alongside a group of students that will get the chance to work on such real challenges with us, with the companies, and we hope to create real win-win concepts for companies and students. And of course, human rights. And so I'm keen to announce the two co-founding companies for the clinic, LafargeHolcim and Trafigura. There are more co-founding spots open. And if you would like to work with us and if you're interested in learning more about the Business and Human Rights Clinic, please reach out to us via the website. And so to close, I'd like to profoundly thank my partners, Davide, Crispin, and Sarah. It's such a pleasure to work with you, and I very much look forward to a third joint event early next year. We'll of course keep all of you posted. There will be a recording, as I mentioned, of the session. There will be a summary paper, and I'd like to thank you for your interest, for your excellent questions, your engagement, and I wish you all the best for the last days of 2020 and the best for 2021, and look forward to seeing you then. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.